grab yourself a beer and settle in with me. This video will be pretty much a recreation of the last one. We use a similar tone of palette, and the techniques described are, identical. So we take a inspirational picture, in this case Augustus. I can't make out the faded other word. One of the Augustuses, maybe the Augustus. And I begin the sketch with off-white. Now this relief is very much more traditional of Roman emperors, Roman personalities, in that you see the side profile of the face. It's not head-on, unlike Uton. You can see I'm straying a little bit outside the circle. Again, I'm not too concerned about breaking the barriers. It's only there as a structure around which we can build a tone, we can build the face. One thing that did seem rather unusual to me is how flat the face was. When drawing characters in relief, I tend to put them the eyes sunken back a bit more, but you can see how the nose is pressed up against the eyes. It follows that noble arching chin, and how the head and neck is quite thick behind it. So this is a strong, powerful man that we're dealing with here. Perfect for Konor, who's always reminded me a little bit of Antonius Pius, one of the good emperors who did not do unusual things to horses or his people or Rome itself. Antonius Pius, he largely ruled during a time of peace, which isn't an exact correlation to Guilliman, but I've always thought of Konor being like Pius in that he was a good statesman. He stayed in a singular area. He ruled largely from Italy. He didn't have much in the way of uprisings, but his successor was Marcus Aurelius, arguably one of the greatest emperors at the time. Somebody who was beset by tragedies, by wars, by famine, everything you can imagine to go wrong at the time of Marcus Aurelius did. And if he wasn't such a strong character, had a strong personality, who knows what would happen? Who knows what would have happened? I'm sure there are very strong counter arguments to what I've just said, and I'd love to hear them in the messages below. But yeah, Konor, strong statesman, strong character, somebody who takes statescraft very perfectly, very personally, very, very, very seriously. These kind of traits that I wanted to represent in the actual paintwork itself. Although not you could describe his personality as stoic. Stoic personality, yeah, sure. I wanted this. These are the kind of things I think of during the painting process. Aside from the technicalities of painting the face, at the moment I've just blocked in the main tones. I will be blocking in the shadows as a relief to his face, so you can see his face in contrast to the dark barrier behind him. These are the kind of thoughts that run through my head, and I do think they go on to influence the paintwork itself. It is worth having this background history, this context behind any character, because there'll be some movement with the brush, something that you'll want to highlight, something you'll push to the fore that maybe won't register obviously in the eye of the viewer, but it's still there nonetheless. All these weird background noise thoughts that you have will bleed through. Okay, on a more technical note, the difference between this and the Uton sculpt is that there's a lot more green here. There's a strong patina on the coin itself that I did want to introduce into the shadows especially. Now I did not need to influence either the shadows or the highlights. Indeed, these colours were lifted directly from the coin itself using Photoshop. The difference would come when I add layers on top. So for example, I'm using ice yellow on top of the green background. The green underlying the ice yellow will affect the top layers. The very simple fact that the green is there will affect all the other colours that precede it, and it will affect the underlying layers. So even though I don't need to affect the other colours by mixing green in with them, the very fact there's green in the mid-tone will help. It will make a difference from this in the Uton relief. Okay, so you can see how I've largely sketched the tones of the face at this point. It's time to tighten things up. As we talked about in the last video, it's time to be an opportunist. It's time to exploit the brush strokes that we've applied to the miniature. We move away from our inspirational picture and we dynamically involve ourselves with the actual piece in front of us. Here I've added a pinch of black to the Rhinox hide and graphite to reinforce the line of his cheek. I'll be oscillating between very dark tones and very light tones at this point to firm everything up, firm his beard up. I don't think this was the original Augustus, because I believe at the time beards were seen more as a Greek affectation, and no upstanding Roman would sport such a thing. Okay, I had the bright idea to write Konor Ultima on the side of his coin because there's so much negative space there. My original intention was to add an Ultima, a U, in relief to the face, but it would be quite light against his face and there wouldn't be the contrast. I think the two would muddy one another. So I wanted that strong dark shadow separating his face from the Konor Ultima. And this is to separate Konor from other Konors. The Roman naming convention was not very original. Again, a background noise thought you have ringing in your head. Romans were not a very original people. When they see a good idea, their strength was taking it and perfecting it. When naming their children, for example, maybe the first two would have names. After that, it would become Quintus, Septimus. So essentially 5, 6, 7. So Konor Ultima might have come from a big family with lots of Konors. There might be a lot of Konors in the Senate. So Konor Ultima puts him at the apex. He is the ultimate Konor. Yep, I really am a product of being an only child. If you would like to learn more about ancient Rome naming customs and conventions, there's an excellent podcast called Ancient Rome. The gentleman who presented has recently written a book called The Storm Before the Storm. Highly recommend it. And you too can have these very unusual thoughts rattling around in your brain. Okay, from here on out, glazes. I've established the main tones of the face. From here, it's finessing them into some kind of shape. The tonality, the tonal qualities, the way I manipulate the brush stroke on the surface of the miniature will determine the volumes. For the beard, I'm using lots and lots of small stippling steps. You can see a pointillism technique to represent the individual hairs of his face, in comparison to the cheek, which has slightly more languorous, longer movements of the brush. It's at this stage where you feel like you've really conquered that hill. You're on the downward slope at this point. The main tones are in place, the structure's in place. It's embellishment from here on out. And feel free to push the embellishment much brighter and lighter than it will be, because we can always glaze that back. The structure is there. At this point, work on the volumes of the piece, the main highlights and shadows, and then use glazes on top to build the tonal differences. So hitting the top of his cheeks. I'm going to leave that in. There's an alarm going off. I'm teaching tomorrow. It's my alarm telling me I'm teaching. Okay, the bridge of his nose. This is all done with a pinch of off-white to ice yellow. The lighter we need to get, the more off-white goes in. The darker we need to be, the more ice yellow gets moved in. I'm using a Winsor & Newton Series 7 00 brush, a new one. I'd like to point out the tip is very fine. It has not split yet because it hasn't come under stringent usage. So it'll retain the point, and it'll also give me excellent moisture in the barrel of the brush itself. As we talked about in the last video, I don't like using miniature brushes for this procedure because I find it hasn't got the bristle length to retain the moisture. I want the barrel to contain a good amount of moisture, so when I apply paint to the miniature, it slips off easier. And I can also do things like this, like mask glazing. So adding Rhinox hide to green. Rhinox hide is quite dark colour, and when we add green to it, we desaturate it slightly and we give that patina effect. Now I'll reapply the Konor. You can see just how thin the glazes are used. The glazes I used are, rather. Sorry, sentence constructors all to hell then. That you can see the underlying layers of my original paint. And this is a little bit of a cheat right here. Because we are using such thin layers, there may be some lines we've applied that we do not like, that we don't feel fit the purpose. We can add several successive glazes on top, we can manipulate them, we can change them, we can paint over them completely. Being an opportunist really helps with our freehand work. Konor Ultima. Yeah, when I pitched the idea to my client, this is part of a triptych of Leviathan dreadnoughts. So the first one was the foundation of Guilliman's thought process, his rule of governance, his rule of ethics, being here identified or here embellished as Konor and Uton. The next one was two horses rearing up on either side of the Leviathan, with the names of the horses underneath in inscriptions, rather on the nose. I called them Roma and Angelo. Cool names for horses, I'm sure you agree, one of which died at one of the sieges, so you had to get another horse. And then the names of the conquered cities are sitting above them, so Illyria and Thrace. Now canonically, he did invade a city-state called Illyria. I'm not sure about Thrace though, that was a bit of artistic license. As were the name of the horses. I have no idea if they've ever been mentioned, whether he even rode a horse into battle. He might have been too big, I don't know. Artistic license. That's what I took in that particular instance. But the third one, it's the triumph of the Ultima Pax over the 500 worlds in the form of the Tetrarchs. So there's another Leviathan that I haven't released any images of yet. Or maybe I have. Yes, I've released work in progress pics of the 4 Tetrarchs of Ultramar. Again, in relief like Konor. And this is Guilliman's triumph, his triumph of reason over chaos, because the Ultima is a symbol for space, I believe. It's not just a U. Just in the same way that Superman's symbol means hope on Krypton, the Ultima, the U, is representative of space. And Guilliman, by creating the Tetrarchy, by subsuming his home worlds, the 500 worlds of Ultramar, this is my way of showing his dominance over the unknown. I'm sure very fitting themes for a conqueror. Okay, here I am using ICL at the very tip of the brush to just highlight the leaves. Before this, I added a very light wash of Rhinox hide across the entire thing. The reason I did this was to stain everything. If we left it as it was, the tones didn't quite work next to one another, so they stood out against one another. I needed something to blend in the tones. By adding this layer of almost grease over the top, It unifies the underlying tones, and I'm then able to use glazes on top, as I'm doing now, to reinforce lines, to fade some back, again, to play with the image. By adding a Rhinox hide glaze over the top, I'm knocking all the values down a couple of notches, and from here I can choose to reinforce them. In the case of the laurel wreath, which I'm doing here, the hair, which I'm building now, top of the nose, top of the eye, I'm drawing detail on top of a darkened surface. And you can do this as many times as you want. This is the refinement process we're going through right here. You can do this refinement process as many times as you want, as many different layers as you wish. So Lupercal Green is just used the very tip of the brush instead of using it as a glaze. It's a glaze consistency, but I've just stabbed it in a few different places in the darker shadows of the coin, of the piece, to give more of a patina effect. Okay, ice yellow is used as a glaze to the back of his neck. Just further push in the tonality in different directions, because the back of the neck would have kind of contra light, so there'd be light from behind as well as in front, and the shadow would actually be running through the center of the face as we look at it. Okay, Rhinox hide glaze once again to knock down the values. I'll do it on Uten's face as well, and it's also handy to give it a bit of dirt. It's the paint equivalent of picking up dirt and rubbing it onto the front surface. Just knocks all the values down, and by value I mean the lightness or darkness of our subject. That's pretty much it. Now, for full disclosure, further refinement work was done off camera. It's far easier to paint when the camera isn't in between you and the subject matter. Far easier, but it follows all the same basic steps that we have established so far. It's just a case of building upon them. So nothing changes, it's just more glazing to bring it up to standard I was happy with. Okay, after all this freehand work, it's good for the soul to cheat at this point. I mean, we've just freehanded two faces right now. We've given ourselves the license to take it a bit easier on ourselves. I want a couple of legends underneath Konor and Uten to really spell out who these people are. So I've taken the legend from the scroll work from the Blood Angel set. I've used Microsol and Microset. First added a gloss layer, then used Microsol. So Microset, the blue one. We used the blue one first. As a thin layer, we use warm water to separate the image from the backing sheet, and we apply it onto the miniature. Now you can see here how I've made kind of a collage out of it. I've cut into the image, I've rearranged things, I've manipulated them, I've finessed them into place until I'm happy with where they sit. I then apply the red solution on top to make sure they bind onto the surface, and use a gloss varnish over the top, then a matte varnish to finally seal them. Next up, in order to knock them back into the scene and make it look like we've actually painted this rather than used a guide, a stencil essentially, we use sandalwood from scale 75 for the top shadow. Then we use ice yellow from Vallejo as a wet blend to create the highlight at the base. Before that has even dried, this is all done very quickly, one after another, in quick succession. We add a pinch of black to Lupercal Green and Rhinox hide, and we apply it into the shadows. Now you can see I've really splayed out the bristles of my brush here. I want texture, I want relief. By relief, I mean the actual texture work of the papyrus that we're trying to represent. Okay, ice yellow is again applied on the top as a glaze layer. Before it dries, I can take a relatively cleanish brush, wipe it across the surface, allowing the dark grey to peek out from underneath. These stages are quite loose in form, quite free form. It's more about tonal range than being neat at this point. Sorry, the creaking you hear is my chair. Then once that's all dried, the layers up until this point, they can be halfway wet. It's all a quick wet blend. Here we need to refine it with ice yellow plus off-white and then pure black into the shadows. Here I'm using, the majority of this final layer is off-white, and this is to make the colours scintillate. It's to really give a hard-edged highlight, so when we look at the image there are no fuzzy patches in between. There's a very hard line separating the legend from the backing. Okay, next up, the actual words themselves. Write out the word you wish to apply to your miniature, in this case Konor. Break it up so we have the beginning, the middle and the end. Like a good story, it needs to flow. It needs those three structures. Then I quickly look on Google, or you could take your time looking at Google. It's your time, you choose to do with it as you wish, and you find an appropriate font. Write this out on a piece of paper. Muscle memory. It's so key in developing your technique. Don't just transfer it. Don't just have a go on your miniature that you've just spent 6 hours freehanding the work on top of. Don't just wing it at this point. Write out the letters first. Split them up. Now sometimes the words won't be odd, so there won't be an odd number of characters in the word, which means there are no definitive middle letters. Just if there are 2 letters in the middle, use those 2. The reason why we're applying this is to the start, the middle and the end is to make sure that the characters in relation to one another are of an appropriate size. We do not want to begin writing the name Konor and find we have to squeeze the R in at the end. So let's begin the painting process. As we talked about in the last lesson, how there's a difficulty with paint actually slipping from the brush. A few coping mechanisms. One, using a good brush, a good new brush, in this case the 00 from Winsor Newton. Using ink, because it has a high density of pigment even when you wash it down. Unlike acrylic, when you add water to it, it starts to become semi-opaque. With this stuff, you water it down and it still keeps its body. And using additives and thinners. I did not need to use them because I live on these sunny isles. But if you do live in a hot country, especially in Australia, I know you guys are coming up to summer now, make sure that you use those additives. Anything to prolong the working life of your paint is a good thing. And you can see I add a very thin spidery line, which I will then thicken up. So we have the K. Let's mark the R, the R. The first mark I make is very thin, very spindly. If I feel like I've made the correct mark, I can thicken it up. If I feel I've made an incorrect mark, I can move it slightly either side and then begin thickening it up. It's important to use a small... In my experience, using a longer bristle brush gives me greater control over the moisture, and it means I can it means that the paint can slip off the brush easier. Lots of artists, lots of really, really unbelievably talented artists. Like artists so talented it makes you physically sick. They use miniature brushes. It's something that I've personally never been able to work out for myself. I've never been able to make it look effective. Now, look away, because I am not making this mistake that you're seeing on screen. No, no, no. I am not dumb enough to write an O in case of the N. Nope, that's not happening. Concentrate on what I'm saying, not what I'm doing. There'll be a point here where I realise what I've done. Yep, there you go. So reapply the previous stages. And paint the middle letter, N. Miniature brushes, it's one of those things I've never been able, or never felt comfortable using. And if you do find this process easier using a miniature brush, then by all means use a miniature brush. These videos, again, I try and reiterate this in every single video, but these are only jumping off points for your own creativity. I never want to present a definitive guide on how to do X. It's my take on X, how I go about doing X. If you find tips in here that help your own work, brilliant, that's exactly what they are for. More importantly, if you're thinking critically and if you are engaged in the video, there'll be certain aspects of my painting style, of my color choice, color selection, technique, that you will evaluate and say that is not for me. And I love hearing students disagree with me, because it means you are thinking critically about your own work. You aren't just following verbatim. You aren't painting by numbers. You are dynamically engaging with your own artwork. And that's the stage I hope you reach during the course of these video tutorials. But I only like you disagreeing with me when it comes to painting. About other matters, politics, religion, agree with me instantly. Okay, Uton. I did not mess that up, thankfully. I didn't write a U or an E instead of the T. We're all learning together. And that's it. That is the Leviathan freehand tutorial. Whew. Wow, what a saga. Whew, we've been on. There are other videos in the tutorial series that will be forthcoming, but I feel like you and me, we need to break away from this mind-altering, back-breaking labour. When it comes, it is frustrating doing freehand for the first time. I remember for the first year or so, I just could not get my head around it. It was very frustrating having to deal with it. But give yourself that license to fail, pick yourself back up again, and try again. This, more than any other technique, is a process of growth, and growth is painful. It's frustrating. There'll be a lot of dips along the road. This isn't a technique that can be easily mastered, but that's what makes it worth learning. It's not something ephemeral, it's not something that's easy to acquire. Things that are easy to acquire, they don't hold as much value as things like this. So make sure that you attempt it, even if you feel it's outside of your realms of experience and skill level. Try it. Just try it once on a small scale, print out a skull, and just do that, and then build up to a face, or if you want to do the muscle structure underneath. But my encouragement from this course and these series of tutorials, please at least make the attempt. I can guarantee you will surprise yourself at the end result if you follow these stages. Thank you very much, guys, for watching this series of freehand tutorials. I hope you've gained a lot of insight and technical knowledge on how to approach your own freehand work. I'll see you in the next series of tutorials, and dare I say it, we are in the run-in to Christmas, where we will be having another Advent series of tutorials. Thank you very much, and I'll see you soon.